What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. So getting into the Sinestro Core War aftermath, this is really kind of like an epilogue slash prologue or prelude. And the reason why is because where most writers, and for those of you guys who are new to comics, most writers will usually write like a crossover event or some huge story arc, and then they'll stop. And they'll just do like some small time story or something like that. Just something that doesn't really tie into anything and is just kind of there. What Jeff Johns did for the whole entirety of Green Lantern is one story arc, the conclusion of a story arc, would lead into the beginning of another story arc. And so this basically goes into Blackest Night, because remember, Blackest Night is the whole idea of like these emerging Lantern Corps and so on, and this great big huge war and you know, all those different things. And so it was cool for what it was, but it was basically this great big huge conflict. And so a lot of the things that we're gonna see between now and the time we start Blackest Night here in the next, I don't know, maybe month or so, a couple months, these things will all basically go into the event of the Blackest Night story itself. So what this does is this picks up again with the aftermath of Sinestro Core War. And in the last video, when we had done that Sinestro Core War, we had talked about how it was really the first major emergence of the Yellow Lanterns, the first major emergence of Sinestro forming his own Lantern Corps. Now remember, where the Green Lanterns basically derive their power from the will aspect of the emotional spectrum, which is to say the ability to overcome fear, the Sinestro Corps derives their power from fear. And so long as there's fear in the universe, so long as there's a singular being that experiences fear or is afraid of something, then the Sinestro Corps will always have power, because again, they derive their power from the emotional spectrum, just this infinite source of emotion. As long as there is a being alive in the universe, there will be different forms of emotions. And so again, with this whole idea, what we know is that the Sinestro Corps rings are still going out and seeking hosts. They're still trying to find people who could be viable candidates to become members of the Sinestro Corps. And that's really one of the basis, or one of the biggest ideas of this, is that Sinestro set it up so that should he be defeated, the Corps will continue to grow. And so the idea is that while all this is happening, we actually pick up with Kyle Rayner and Guy Gardner. Now remember, Kyle Rayner and Guy Gardner, as part of the Green Lantern Corps, do their own thing for the most part, but the Green Lantern Corps line of stories ran side by side with the main Green Lantern stories, in the sense that the Green Lantern Corps just focused on the other Corps members, what the other members outside of Hal Jordan were basically doing. And the funny thing about this is it's basically Guy Gardner and Kyle Rayner taking off and intending to live on Oa, and then Guy Gardner wanting to open a bar. And it's kind of a funny scenario, because remember, these characters come from their own backgrounds. They come from their own heritages, their own stories, and for the most part, they've all lost a lot of different things. Kyle Rayner more so than most. Kyle Rayner's girlfriends have all been killed. You know, he lost his mother to a parasite that was basically a member of the Sinestro Corps. You know, they've all lost different things. And so leaving planet Earth and taking up residence on Oa serves two purposes. The first is that within the confines of the Green Lantern mythos, it gives Kyle Rayner and Guy Gardner their own stories, their own adventures they can go out on and do their own thing. But the other half of this is that it actually sets the stage for future events later on with regards to why it is that they're in space, as opposed to Hal Jordan, who's spending some of his time on Earth. So again, it's really setting the stage for a lot of the things that we will see later on down the line when it comes to the Green Lantern mythos. Now at this point, we pick up with Mongol, who is the son of Mongol, which is kind of weird. The first Mongol, or as is usually referred to, Mongol 1, is basically like this pre-Crisis on Infinite Earths character that served the purpose of just being a major foe of Superman. The idea though was that with this version of Mongol, basically Mongol 2, as a lot of people call him, he made his emergence in 1995 with the Showcase line of stories, I think it was. And I want to say the Showcase stories in the mid-90s were basically stories that were designed to literally showcase different villains and heroes and so on and so forth. But the idea is that the original Mongol had helped to destroy Coast City, which set in motion the idea of Hal Jordan being possessed by Parallax and then becoming a villain and so on and so forth. What Mongol 2 did is he basically followed up with his father's grand schemes of trying to either defeat the Justice League or defeat Superman or something along those lines, but he basically became a villain. Now his big claim to fame was having a helping hand in Superman, basically being prepared for the invasion of Imperiex. And Imperiex is of course basically DC's version of Galactus. I mean, there's really no way to say it. I mean, that's pretty much what he was. But the idea is that despite a few instances here and there when Mongol has helped out Superman, they've basically become unwilling allies due to a common enemy that was stronger than both of them individually. For the most part, Mongol has just always been a bad guy. And so what ended up happening here, or at least what ends up taking place here, is that Mongol is bestowed with the Yellow Lantern ring. Now remember, this makes sense because when it comes to the Yellow Lantern rings, they're designed to instill fear. And we saw during the Sinestro Corps War that like Anti-Monitor and Hank Henshaw, Cyborg Superman, that Superboy Prime, these various individuals had basically been imbued with a Yellow Lantern Lantern ring because of the fact that they were able to, instill so much fear in individual people. Mongol is much the same way. The difference here is that he actually has kind of an ace up his sleeve, a really cool hat trick that actually works really well for the purpose that he serves. Now again, jumping back to Kyle Rayner and Guy Gardner, with the whole idea of the story, humor is kind of an important aspect of the Green Lantern mythos, especially with what's coming later on down the line, because things are going to get really, really dark. No pun intended. When Blackest Night rolls around, things will get really dark. Like it'll be really kind of crazy. But again, for these guys, it's a matter of just kind of trying to make a way for themselves, trying to make their own little home, home away from home, and taking up residence on Oa. Now remember, this is not unprecedented. There are people who simply just reside on Oa. Kilowog, for example, resides on Oa. Salak resides on Oa. These different members of the Green Lantern mythos, of course, Kilowog basically being the drill sergeant for the Green Lantern Corps, and Salak being the voice of the Guardians of the Universe, it makes sense that they would reside on Oa. But for Guy Gardner and Kyle Rayner, they can really serve or really have the best use when they're on Oa. And the reason for this is because of the fact that, remember, with regards to the Green Lanterns, for the most part, Earth is the only planet that really has like 4 different Green Lanterns. You've got Kyle Rayner, you've got John Stewart, you've got Guy Gardner, and you've got Hal Jordan. You don't need 4. You really only need 2. And so again, we have John Stewart and Hal Jordan back on Earth, and we've got Guy Gardner and Kyle Rayner, out in space. Now, the other half of this is, remember, Mongol is as intelligent as he is powerful. And that's one of the things that makes him so dangerous, is because he is so capable. And so where some individuals would have received a Yellow Lantern ring and then would have immediately just like jumped out into the fray and started fighting Green Lanterns or something along those lines, Mongol takes a far different approach. Instead, he basically has a Lantern ring spend 96 hours giving him all the information that the Lantern ring knows. And so over the course of this 72-hour window, Mongol had learned about the origin of the Sinestro rings, he learned about the history of Sinestro himself, he'd learned about the Green Lanterns, he learned about the Blackest Night prophecy, he'd learned all these different things. Basically everything we've covered up to this point, he was given all that information within really like 96 hours or 72 hours, wherever the case may be. And so the result is that the Guardians of the Universe begin to realize that all these different Sinestro Corps rings are basically taking off to the Vega system. And the result is that they begin calling back together all these different members of the Green Lantern Corps. Now, for those of you guys who have read ahead, please do not spoil anything about the Vega system, because I know what you're thinking. Do not spoil anything about the Vega system, but what I will say is there's actually a reason why the Green Lanterns are not supposed to go to the Vega system. There's actually a really cool basis behind that. But the funny thing about this is that they're actually instructed to do so. Now, again, we'll get into that once we get into like the whole, Prelude to Blackest Night and different things like that. But the idea here is that for the Guardians of the Universe, while there have been treaties and so on that have been struck over the course of their existence with different races and groups that exist across the universe, occasionally the Guardians of the Universe will violate those treaties. And the reason for that is because the threat is just that credible. And so there's 2 things going on here. The first is that these Sinestro Corps rings are disappearing to the far side of the universe. And 2, some individuals who are being given Sinestro Corps rings are just dying all of a sudden, and nobody knows why. But what we end up doing is we transition back to Mongol. And what we end up finding out here is that Mongol himself is basically traveling around to these different individuals who have been given Sinestro Corps rings and offers them 2 options. The first is to either serve Mongol, or the second is to die. And a lot of them just refuse. They simply refuse to serve Mongol, because remember, the Sinestro Corps rings bond themselves to what are basically bullies. And so if you're a person that's been more or less dominating a local village or a small territory or something along those lines, and then suddenly a Sinestro Corps ring appears to you, well, you're going to do what you do best. You're just going to start bullying people. And then if somebody else comes along and says, you work for me now, well, of course you're going to resist that. The difference here is that we have a guy who's basically on par with Superman in a lot of ways, who's now been given a Sinestro Corps ring. And so these average bad guys out there, these average bullies who have dominated these small little towns or something like that, while the Yellow Lantern ring does give them a whole host of abilities, they have neither the brains nor the forethought to be able to use them effectively, and they're easily dominated by Mongol. And so the result is that he's been going around killing these different Sinestro Corps members and then taking their rings. Now, what this does is it basically picks up with the idea of these different individuals who are being sent out in groups for the purpose of tracking down these rings and what it is happening to these people. Now, also remember, Sodom Yat is now Ion. And of course, if you missed the last video, Sodom Yat was this character who was basically introduced as a what if scenario, like what if Superman got a Green Lantern ring? Because Sodom Yat descends from a group that are basically called Daxamites, but they are a branch off of traditional Kryptonians. And so when exposed to a yellow sun, suddenly Sodom Yat has all the powers of Superman Superman combined with a Green Lantern ring. Now, the reason why he's Ion, and the distinction between Ion and a regular Lantern, is that Sodom Yat is basically imbued with pure willpower, with the Ion entity. And of course, the Ion entity is a physical manifestation of the emotion of willpower. So again, that's how all this stuff really kind of comes together, and we'll see that more over the course of the Green Lantern mythos. And of course, Parallax, the entity that represents fear, that, you know, again, Ion is the entity that represents will, and we'll see things like the Bull, which is the entity that represents, you know, rage for the Red Lantern Corps, and so on and so forth. But the fact remains here that with Ion and Arisia, I think it is, that are basically traveling to, you know, these different Lantern locations and so on and so forth, the other members of the Lantern Corps are coming across these basically like these giant body parts, limbs and so on, that belong to just different members of the Sinestro Corps who were defeated, who were dismembered, so on and so forth, only for us to find out Mongol has captured Arisia and Sodom Yat, and has basically bestowed upon them these Black Mercy plants. Now remember, these Black Mercy plants are what it is that makes Mongol such a dangerous foe and differentiates him from the other members of, you know, really the Sinestro Corps, or really any other villain that exists out there in the realm of DC Comics. And the reason why I say this is because remember, the Black Mercy plants, as we talked about in our DC Rebirth video about Trinity, basically were bonded to a host, and in turn, that host would enter this kind of dream state. They would basically experience this whole illusion with no real idea of what was going on around them. And so the result of this is that we actually end up finding out that with Arisia and with Sodom Yat being taken away, that normally it's supposed to be this kind of happy experience. You go through these dreams and you have these incredible experiences. You basically live out this almost perfect life. But instead, Arisia and Sodom Yat are experiencing absolute nightmares. And so again, this is kind of a cool moment, because what this does is it basically comes back and it goes through this basis behind the Mercy Plan, its origin, how it all comes together, so on and so forth. And so where the other Green Lanterns are able to jump in, you know, and rescue Sodom Yat and rescue Arisia, again, it's basically this idea that there's like this Mother Mercy, more or less, I guess this Black Mercy Prime, so to speak, that's giving birth to all these different plants that Mongol's been using. And so what we end up finding out here is that where Mongol's going through and again, basically taking all these Black Mercy seedlings, firing them, you know, into the universe for the purpose of just more or less taking people over, that he's essentially gone through and modified, or at least he's benefiting from these modified Black Mercy plants, in the sense that the Black Mercy plants, where they're supposed to instill people with, you know, happy experiences, and instead are forcing them to experience a massive amount of fear. The overarching goal of Mongol is to basically force everybody in the universe to feel fear, and in turn empower himself with this virtually unrivaled level of power that nobody else could begin to grasp. And so the result is that where the Green Lanterns go through and they start freeing Sodom Yat and so on and so forth, that the Black Mercy plant basically speaks directly to them. The Mother Mercy plant basically says that originally it was designed for the purpose of making death an easy passing, that those beings who experienced death, getting ready to pass over, they would basically be imbued with these plants, and they wouldn't experience the horrific turning, the horrific circumstances under their own death, meaning they wouldn't suffer pain and different things like that. Instead, they would basically pass on with no real impact on what it is that was happening to them. Instead, what ended up happening is the first Mongol had come along and grabbed these Black Mercy plants and then basically started screwing with them and started modifying them and turning them into something that could be used for evil. And so the result is that he intends to again basically blanket the universe in fear and empower himself. Now, the reason why this story matters so much, and the reason why this is such an important aspect, is because again, much like the stories that we saw where, you know, you'd have like Hal Jordan Most Wanted, kind of this one-off story that existed out there by themselves, what this also does is it basically lays the groundwork for the rise of the Star Sapphires. Because remember, the Star Sapphires are basically the Lantern Corps that deal with love. They believe love is an extreme thing. We had talked about how Carol Ferris had been transformed into a Star Sapphire, and then she was eventually freed from its control. This is going to see them come back, and it's going to see them being one of the other Lantern Corps that are starting to rise to prominence. And so again, it's these small little things that are written into this story. It's these small little moments where we basically have this great big huge event that doesn't really seem to tie into anything, and then it's just this little tidbit. Much like we saw with our previous Lantern videos, you know, where it was basically the Justice League fighting alongside the Green Lantern against some force, and then suddenly a Sinestro Corps ring suddenly appears to Bruce Wayne and says, you know, look, you know, Bruce Wayne, you have the ability to instill great fear, welcome to the Sinestro Corps, and then eventually just kind of abandons him, you know, after realizing that he had used a Green Lantern ring. But the fact remains here that with the Green Lanterns able to overcome these Black Mercy plants and effectively defeating Mongol, this leads to his character just kind of being kept in stasis and being kept on the back burner. And the reason why is because once we start to get into the whole element of Blackest Blackest Night and different things like that, that he'll actually make a return, that he'll actually end up coming back. And the result is that he'll play a more significant role in the different stories that we see leading into Blackest Night and so on and so forth. Now, the other half of this is the, again, Mother Mercy plan herself, in the sense that she's actually inducted into the Green Lantern Corps because of the fact that she has the ability to lean to both sides. Where the Black Mercy plants have the ability to force people to experience utter fear, and at the same time, give people the ability to overcome fear, she's basically given a choice. Either she can choose a Yellow Lantern ring or she can choose a Green Lantern ring, and the result is that she ends up choosing a Green Lantern ring and joining the Green Lantern Corps. But again, this is really the end of the story. I mean, there's not a whole lot here, not a great big huge set of events. A villain that's obscure to most people who don't read comic books gets a Yellow Lantern ring for a little while and then is ultimately defeated. But again, it's these moments, it's these small little panels, these small little segments, these stories that don't seem wildly interesting that become important later on down the line. And that's why we're covering them, because normally I would have just skipped over this. It wouldn't have been important, it would have served no real purpose, but we'll reference back to these things. We'll talk about how Mongol got a lantern ring. We'll make reference to these particular circumstances so that way people won't feel left out. They'll be able to go back and watch the videos and see what we're talking about and that kind of a thing. But in any event, if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.